Okay, folks, I think we're going to go ahead and get started in a second if people want to come in and get seated. Let the last few folks finish their conversations at the tables outside, and we'll get underway here. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. I'm Roland Wall. I'm the director of the Patrick Center for Environmental Research here at the Academy. We're very pleased to be presenting another Town Square. Town Square is a periodic series. We try to do a couple of them a season now. About 2 years ago, the Academy began to take positions on particular issues. We thought there were issues that were of sufficient importance and had a sufficient scientific credibility that we began to put some statements out on them. And those ended up being 4 particular topics: climate change, water conservation, biodiversity, and evolution. We try to gear our town squares to those topics. That's why you see climate change up there tonight. Actually, tonight we're doing voting for the environment, so all of those issues will come up. But certainly in light of recent news, climate change is very important. We're very happy to have another opportunity to encourage dialogue, thought, and action on topical and complex public issues, particularly where science and the environment are concerned. A little background: many of you know, hopefully most of you know, the Academy is the oldest natural history institution in the Western Hemisphere. Our staff is dedicated particularly to advancing research, education, and public engagement in the fields of biodiversity and the environment. We're especially committed to promoting the role of science. Excuse me, I'm going to have to do this. I apologize, I'm fighting a cold, so my voice may go out a little bit tonight. We're committed to promoting the role of science in public dialogue and particularly to using it to better understand and frame key issues. We have, just as sort of our statement of qualifications, we have more than 50 research staff working behind the scenes, doing cutting-edge work on everything from systematics to evolution to ecology to paleontology. We also have a vast collection of about 18 million specimens of plants and animals from all around the world. These are an irreplaceable resource in understanding the life on our planet. So we have different directions we come at it. The Patrick Center for Environmental Research was founded in 1947. And our group from that time to the present continues to work to understand, protect, and restore the health of watersheds and coastal areas. Together, our goal is to develop innovative strategies to address some of today's most critical environmental issues. Part of the strategy is to encourage and convene thinking and dialogue on these issues, and that's what Town Square and tonight's program is about. So last week, the urgency of developing and implementing these strategies was reemphasized when the UN issued its latest report on climate change. We'll be talking about some of that more later with our panelists, but one of the important connections it drew was between good governance and environmental protection. And this is something that's been understood for a long time. 2 years ago, the UN issued its Sustainable Development Goals, outlined explicitly that building effective and accountable institutions at all levels is one of the most important elements for building sustainability. Their key recommendation on this goal is to use your right to elect the leaders of your country and local community. So use your right to elect your leaders, and that's really what we're talking about tonight. I'm assuming everyone knows we have an election coming up. Might have heard about it. In some ways, it's probably the most interesting midterm election in my memory. They can be a little dull sometimes, and this one definitely isn't. Protecting the environment and supporting sustainability are just one of the sets of issues in the election, but they're a really important set of issues, and we think we need to talk about them more. So we thought it might be a good idea to get some folks together. I don't think they'll mind me referring to them as seasoned professionals, and they are. We're looking at a lot of experience with the nuts and bolts of environmental policy and advocacy. And we want to hear thoughts on what are the most important environmental issues in the upcoming election. Now, let me just say one thing for point of clarification. The Academy does take positions on issues. We said that, and it's become an important part of how we relate to the public. But we are, however, remain completely nonpartisan, and we're not here tonight to tell you who to vote for, and we aren't trying to decide for you. That's everyone's individual choice, and making that decision is one of the most sacred rights of our society. Tonight is about the issues and how the election might relate to important policies. None of the opinions voiced by our panelists or by the guests in the audience in any way reflect positions of the Academy or Drexel. Our goal is for everyone to leave tonight more informed and hopefully more thoughtful in how they make their choice in their upcoming vote. Before we get started, just thank everyone on our staff who have been involved in putting this together, and especially our panelists and all of you for being here with us this evening. So let's begin. This is going to be fairly informal, fairly open-ended. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, ask them to join me at the table here, and then give each of them a chance to make some brief comments to help frame the discussion. And then I'll pose a few questions. We'll get some discussion going. And at some point, we'll open things up for the audience for questions and comments as well. We'll see where that takes us, and around 8 o'clock, we'll call it a night. So we are very happy to have with us tonight three, as I say, experts in the field of environmental policy and advocacy who have been involved in some of the details of that kind of work. I'm going to introduce them, and then after I've done all that, they can join me up here. Julie Slavitt is the Executive Director of the Tacony Frankford Watershed Partnership. I got it, okay. And Julie is also a former congressional aide, so we're looking to hear some of her information on that. Josh McNeil is the Executive Director of Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. He's also Vice President for Civic Engagement of Penn Future. There was a last-minute change. Joe Minot from the Clean Air Council unfortunately had a last-minute conflict. Very sorry he couldn't join us, but we were very happy and very appreciative that Anna Ship from the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia will be joining us. Anna is the Executive Director there, and we're looking forward to hearing perspective from more of a business and economic stand as well. So I would ask folks to join me on stage, and let's welcome them while they're doing that, and we'll sit down and start talking. And seat yourselves as you see fit. Now they're all going to have to rearrange themselves here. I have a lavalier. You guys have the mics. Let's get things kicked off. I wanted to, as I think I've asked for each of you, to maybe take a few minutes and talk a little bit about the work you're doing and some of the thoughts, sort of immediate thoughts you have on the current situation. It's an interesting situation. So, no particular order. Julie, do you want to kick off? You're to my immediate right, and so.
I'm happy to do that. Again, I'm the director of the Tacony Frankford Watershed Partnership, which we're now going to just call TTF. What I want to bring to this is a couple of different perspectives. One of them is running a small watershed organization that's really focused on watershed improvement. And what that means, and the other is I feel like I've had a real opportunity to be on the other side. I was the district director for Congresswoman Allison Schwartz for 6 years, so I got to see what how a congressional office operates, how members of Congress deal with the public, what's important for the public to do, and I've also worked at all levels of government. So I've worked for state government, Congress and local government as well. So I want to sort of bring that to this. I think that what we've seen since the election of our current president has been a remarkable move towards people sort of expressing how they feel about things, which I think is really good. I think that environmental folks are often quiet. And I think that it's important for us to talk about what we really care about in the world. And I think that one of the things that I think I have learned sort of in the past, couple of years here is, that we stand on very broad shoulders. So both in terms of as an activist and also an environmentalist, lots of people before us worked really hard to get the kind of legislative, environmental legislation that we have. And I'm going to leave policy to
Please don't.
this guy over here. But I think I wanted to sort of bring that perspective as I think something that's really important to think about. It's great to have, sort of new energy and new people involved, but I think it's always, just like with any issue, like voting rights, or women's rights, or human rights at all, people have been working hard on these issues, and people have died working on these issues. So, for environmentalists, it's important for us, I think, to think back to what people, that clean air and clean water legislation didn't just happen. So I think it's important to have that perspective. So that was sort of just the first thing that I wanted to just sort of share, is that we should all keep that in mind and learn from, and appreciate that, and then also learn from past strategies, and realize that there are incredible organizations out there, and I think I'll end with that, incredible organizations out there who have been doing this work for a very long time that we should support and rely on.
Great. Anna, you wanna?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And it's, I agree. I also think that it's challenging for me to kind of, oh, goodness.
I said we need to bring it too close.
Is that better? Okay. I was just saying it's also, exhausting sometimes to we have been talking about this for a really, really long time. So I'm Anna. I'm the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Network of Greater Philadelphia. For those that don't know us, we are a community of locally owned, independently held businesses, all of whom are values-based businesses, so they all practice something called the triple bottom line. So through their products, their services, their internal practices, they are serving the needs of their communities, they are sharing wealth, and they are protecting the environment. So from our perspective, the environment is inextricably linked with social justice, social equity, and economic health. And so we see every day the degree to which businesses can build profitable enterprises with environmental policy that is responsible environmental policy that's protecting our watersheds and protecting our air through energy policy and things like that. So from our perspective, we want to bring the economic voice to this. We want to bring the business voice to this conversation. There's a misperception that environmental policy is bad for the economy. It's bad for business. It's just there will be some winners and there will be some losers. From our perspective, it's what are the kinds of businesses that we want to grow, what's the kind of economy that we want to grow, and it's one that is socially responsible, environmentally resilient, and of course economically strong. So that's where we're coming from this conversation.
Great, Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh McNeil. I'm the Executive Director of Conservation Voters of Pennsylvania. We're the independent state affiliate of the National League of Conservation Voters. If you've ever heard of one of us, you've probably gotten a few 100,000 emails from us at this point. I'm also the Vice President for Civic Engagement at Penn Future. So I have two different jobs, both of which are excellent jobs and really fun at this time of year. Penn Future is sort of a statewide environmental organization that looks to promote good energy policy, good clean water policy, good clean air policy, and does it through a number of means. They've got a team of lawyers who like to sue people who are polluting things around our neighborhoods. They've got advocates, they've got lobbyists. That's sort of what Penn Future does. And my job there is to try and get more citizens engaged in that process. And then at Conservation Voters, our job is to yell at politicians, and that's really my favorite thing to do. It's fun. It's something I hope you'll join me in doing, and over the course of the night, I'll tell you some ways to do that. But our job is to simply make a better playing field for all the other environmental groups in the state. And there are dozens of environmental organizations in the state. One of the great weaknesses of our movement is that we are legion. We are scattered in dozens of different ways, and it's, this group can raise a little money and this group can raise a little money. There's not like one big monolithic group like the NRA. Whether you agree with them or not, they're really good at what they do. We don't have that kind of thing, but it also can be a great strength in sort of diversity. We got perspectives like Anna's bringing a business perspective, perspectives like mine bringing an angry activist perspective to things. So one of the things I'm most proud of this year that we've been able to do is a common agenda. Put together by the Green and 18 program at Penn Future. It's actually the first time we've gotten more than 24 environmental organizations to get together and say, this is what needs to happen next year. And we've taken that to the governor, we've taken that to Senator Wagner, both candidates for governor, and said, this is what the next governor needs to accomplish for the environment in Pennsylvania. We have met with varying degrees of interest from the two different candidates, specifically on different issues. Some of them are more excited than others, but overall, one of the things we're trying to do is shape the movement and get the whole movement moving in the same direction. And so I'm excited to have a chance to talk to you all tonight. I hope that you will be advocates. There are 3 things I'm going to ask you to do, and I'm going to ask you to do them many times over the course of the night. I'm going to ask you to vote on November 6th. I'm going to ask you to give money to environmental organizations, preferably mine, but any of them would be fine. This stuff isn't free. It costs money to do. That's a key way to support it. And then third, I'm going to ask you to get to personally know your state representative. And we could talk more about that later. It's really easy. They want to do it. They're nice people. Mostly around here anyway. So that's me.
Thanks, Josh, and we'll give all the organizations a chance to ask for donations as well. So we're playing an equal field, equal playing field here. So let's just start with a few questions. I was going to call it the elephant in the room, but that might seem partisan. So the elephant or the donkey or whatever large animal in the room is disrupting things. It's climate change, and I think we talk about it a lot here because it's clearly got such a strong scientific component. But it also clearly the science isn't enough to deal with it right now. So the UN has just issued another report. It seems like those come out fairly frequently. This one in particular is probably even more alarming than the last one, which was probably even more alarming than that. So I guess the question, it's really sort of a general thought, and you guys can think how you want to take it. The connections between the upcoming local, state, and federal elections and the long-term issue of climate change. What should voters be thinking about when they're talking to their candidates? And what are steps that anyone as a citizen could take, whether it's voting or other activities, if they really feel the same urgency for climate change that 97% of scientists do?
Well, I'm going to say something really short, and then I'm going to pass it on to you guys. I think we need to obviously keep talking about climate change. I'm sorry. We didn't have to have this really close, but I guess
I think we
do.
are going to have to be closer to the mic.
Okay. Whoa. I think we need to keep talking about climate change. I think one of the things that frightens me is that I feel like, and I'm a boomer, so I feel like people in my generation tend to sort of talk about this like it's a fluke, and I think that we need to get better about that because our children are really terrified. And I think having those kind of conversations with your kids in their 20s and 30s is really important because they think about it all the time. So I think we need to keep having those conversations, and I think that we need to support candidates who agree with science and are going to make the kind of choices that we want to see happen.
Who agree with an undebatable scientific? Okay, yeah.
Undebatable. Yep.
I'm grateful that this most recent report was as strongly worded as it is. I think that to some opening remarks, we've been relatively gentle with our concerns, relatively gentle. And I think that it's really important to not be gentle anymore. I also think that, it's apparently easy. One of the lessons that we've learned is that it's apparently easy for decision makers to dismiss the environment, just as tree hugging, concerns. But if you make it an economic issue, which it is, if you make it a social issue, which it is, but it's really the economic issue that's really going to get the attention of your politicians, it's directly tied to the economy, and I have some really, really powerful statistics here. We're seeing really incredible economic growth at the local level, at the state level, when it comes to water policy and energy policy, and we're seeing really, really alarming economic impact numbers as a result of disasters, climate-related disasters, including in the past year, and so I'm more than happy to give those statistics. I have a lot of them. But it's an economic issue, and I think that we need to bring that to the attention of decision makers. I think we need to hold them accountable for that. And it's no decision maker is going to say they're not pro-business. And so if we make it about the economy, I think we have some traction.
So, Anna, you cited a couple of those when we were talking before things. Maybe just one or two to give folks a sense of what you're talking about.
Sure. So at a local level in Philadelphia, for those that might not know, we have a really phenomenal nature-based stormwater management program called Green City Clean Waters. And so it's trying to engineer nature back in the city to manage our stormwater problem. And we're looking at in economic projections are looking at a $3.1 billion dollar.
Just use
Just
the,
that mic.
yeah, let's just
Okay.
use that one.
Oh, okay.
Got it.
Yeah,
Now we
we're-
get it.
Apologies, we're,
Okay. We're looking at projections that are estimating over the life of this 25-year plan that public and private investments in nature-based solutions are expected to produce a $3.1 billion impact in the Philadelphia economy, supporting conservatively 1,000 jobs per year and generating conservatively $2 million per year in local tax revenues. That's nothing to sneeze at. At the state level, a recent report published by E2, which is kind of a group that's part of the NRDC, Natural Resource Defense Council, finds that there are more than 86,000 clean energy jobs in Pennsylvania across all 67 counties, the 11th most clean jobs among all 50 states in the District of Columbia. And again, this report's also pretty conservative because it focused only on the energy sector of the economy and didn't include related jobs, related green jobs at all. And then the number that couple numbers at the national level. So last year was the costliest string of weather events in U.S. history. We had hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, and of course the dozens of wildfires that we had. The combined costs were estimated to be somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. And then this one's a real kicker. I'm just going to rattle them all off.
we'll do more with them later. So that's
Yeah. So more later, so I don't need to get this one now.
No, that's fine. I just say we'll discuss this
All right.
also more later.
So last one then, the kicker, adding up the economic losses from extreme weather events, more frequent weather events, and of course the health impacts from air pollution, a report last year-ish found that over the last decade, the U.S. has lost an average of $240 billion each year, which is 1.5% of the U.S. GDP. In the decade ahead, those economic losses and health losses could reach $360 billion annually. And those annual average economic losses and health costs total to about 40% of the current growth of the U.S. economy. That is huge, huge. So it's an economic, absolutely an economic issue, and we have to get those numbers in front of our decision makers.
Yeah, and I think that's, as we go along talking this evening, I think this gives us some thought about messaging and where we're going with. This should be a powerful message. It shouldn't be, there shouldn't be the kind of doubts that people have on it. We should be able to get that across. And I'm sorry, Josh, why don't you, your thoughts on all this?
Sure. My son is 2, and I think this one works. So this is why you have to give money to environmental organizations, is better microphones.
Better equipment.
My son's 2, and my wife and I had a conversation about a second kid, and she brought it up the day of the UN report. How do you do that to a kid? I haven't wrapped my head around it yet, but like, do we need to train them in survival skills? It's that level of thinking that we're having to think about right now. It's just, it blows my mind. And how does half the country not believe this is true? We're the only country in the world where that's the case. Why? Money. Pure and simple. If we want to fix climate change, honestly, the best policy we could fight for and enact is campaign finance reform.
Yes.
There is simply, thank you. There is, Conservation Voters releases a report, sort of whenever we can raise the money to release the report, called marcellusmoney.org that tracks, and this is just gas industry spending in the state of Pennsylvania. And they give an average of $1.6 million a year to our state legislators. Pennsylvania has no campaign finance limits, which means that literally they're writing $25,000 checks to folks like actually, I'm sorry, I promised Roland I wouldn't get too political, to certain people in the legislature.
It's elections. We're going to have to be a little political, and maybe no name naming.
Sure. MarcellusMoney.org, feel free to find out for yourself. There's a reason we don't have a severance tax in this state. There's a reason we don't have strong limits on methane leaks in this state. There's a reason that they can build a pipelines for some of the most populous parts of Chester, Delaware, and Philadelphia counties, and there's nothing we can do about it in this state. And it's because unlimited sums of money are being poured into our elected officials by an industry that does not want regulation at any cost. And Exxon's been doing this at the federal level for 30 years. They released documents recently that said Exxon knew global warming was a thing in the 80s and has been fighting it and covering it up since then. There's a reason. It's going to be really expensive to fix this problem. It's going to be especially expensive if you're an oil company. It's a lot cheaper to buy Congress than it is to buy solar panels for the whole country. And so the first thing we got to do is just, you got to shame them when this happens. You need to be on the phones, you need to be out in public, shaming a public official when they're fighting for a gas or a coal or an oil lobbyist instead of for the future of this country and the kids who are in it. You got to shame them. It's the only thing that works, and it works pretty well, especially at the state level. Pennsylvania is responsible for 1% of all of the global warming pollution in the world. Yeah. 1% of all the global warming pollution in the world comes from our state. Is staggering. I used to know the rest of the math that went with that, but I don't remember. But 1% of the global warming. We're a coal state. We've been generating coal. We burn a lot of coal. We've got coal plants all over the place. The gas industry came in. They promised they were going to do better, but it turns out gas is only cleaner if you don't leak methane, and they have managed to crush every attempt to regulate methane leaks since they've been in the state. So now we're leaking a lot of methane. We're probably just as bad as we were before. A lot of the studies haven't yet been done, but there is so much work to be done here in Pennsylvania. We have a real opportunity. The country's really big. There's a limited amount, your vote counts as much as it counts in the nation. We're in a swing state, so your vote counts more than, mine used to when I lived in Alabama. But here in the state, we can change a lot. We need to be talking to our candidates for governor. We need to be talking to our state senators and our state representatives. I'm not talking about our US senators and congressmen. You should talk to them. But you should actually get to know your state representatives and make sure that they have a good answer for what they're doing about this issue. They only represent about 60 to 70,000 people. If you're someone who actually shows up at their office and has a meeting, they'll remember you. They'll get to know you. And a year from now, when we do this meeting, I hope that each of you will have taken one afternoon and gone and met that person and talked to them about this issue. It's the only way we're going to move the ball forward, is that the state legislators in this state need to feel like there's real pressure to start investing in renewable energy, start regulating methane, start reducing our carbon imprint, because 1% is simply unconscionable.
Thanks, Josh. One of the things I have with me a copy of the IPCC report. Actually, it's the executive summary, and even that's a little bit daunting if you feel like digging in and reading it, though. But one of the things I think with climate change, it can get a little frustrating, and it can also be a little depressing to think about. One of the points they made in this report, and I think that did get some press, is that there's a pretty good indication that were we able to limit climate change or limit greenhouse gas emissions going forward and reach what they call net zero in a reasonable amount of time, the existing loading of carbon in the atmosphere, which we know is going to cause some temperature rise, is probably not going to push it over a critical level, the 1.5 degrees that they identified. So it's sort of like we're getting word this is our chance. This is our space in here. Maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's less or more, depending on how emission rates rise or go down. But there is certainly there is a little bit of a voice of hope there that we have not yet necessarily gone over the edge in terms of the damage that's been done. So it's worth thinking about as you think about how you want to influence policy or electorate or elections or whatever. So we can come back to climate change, and as I say, it's usually hanging over us on a lot of things. But I just wanted to give the panelists a chance to say on a more open-ended way. If you think about it, what's sort of the most, if you were going to pick like the 3 issues that a voter might want to think about when they're looking at the environment, 3 environmentally related issues, that a voter might want to think about or they might want to ask their candidate about? Aside from climate change, as I say, which sort of overrides everything, what would be sort of the big ones that you would want to get in front of people?
So a lot of it depends on where you are. Environmental issues are extremely local, right? We've all seen the bumper sticker. One of the things that's happening this year that's particularly interesting is that fracking's been a big part of the politics in this state for about a decade, but the pipelines are only now getting to the eastern side of Pennsylvania. So they're just now coming through Delaware County and Chester County. There's one coming down through Bucks County. And these are nice suburban neighborhoods where they really don't want pipelines in their backyard. And so that's actually really transforming the politics of those areas for the first time. So there's local issues like that. Or up in Horsham, in Montgomery County, the old Air Force base there, they used to spray this fire retardant foam on the runways at the Air Force base, and now there's this deadly carcinogen that's in the water supply for tens of thousands of people. Those local issues really matter. Lead in so many neighborhoods, and so many, Pittsburgh is having a huge lead issue. That's a big issue there. So there's that local issue. Every place has got their own one, and I'm sure you know what it is in your neighborhood. One that doesn't get a lot of play, because it's really not sexy to talk about, is funding. So you can have all the good laws you want. If you don't have cops to enforce those laws are pretty useless. President Trump has gutted the EPA, right? The EPA scientists are retiring like crazy because they can't stand to be told not to do their jobs. They've laid people off. They've turned the whole organization against its own mission. It's a disaster that's going to take a decade to rebuild. What you've read about that, right? Scott Pruitt was really kind of a perfect symbol of all of that before he got thrown out. At the state level, we've cut state funding for our Department of Environmental Protection by 50% over the last decade. It's a much quieter thing you probably haven't heard about, but even as the gas industry has ballooned, as sort of environmental threats have grown in the state, we've fired half the cops who are supposed to be on the beat. So even if we had great methane regulations, there's no one to walk along the pipeline routes and check to see if there's methane leaking. So we need revenue in this state. There's a lot of perfectly fair argument over whether or not a severance tax is a good idea. We need some money to come into the state to start funding our programs, both the DEP and the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. If you want parks, if you want forests protected, there's a great amount of public land in this state. It's a beautiful state full of gorgeous public lands that all of it has just got tens of millions of dollars of backlog. We used to fund it with a thing called Growing Greener. It's time for a new Growing Greener program to put more funding into that. So it's not something a lot of people are going to ask their elected officials about, but I would ask you to, because it's something that really matters. Again, it's not climate change. It's hard to hold a sign that says, like, please give bureaucrats more money. But it's something we really need to do. And then finally, water. This state needs a comprehensive water plan that addresses everything from lead in water to our aging stormwater infrastructure. We got a lot of old cities in this state, which means our pipes and our sewers are really old, which means they don't work all that well. So when there's a big storm, nasty, nasty things go into the water, into the Delaware River, from which 15 million of us drink. So that's one that needs a comprehensive solution. The state's really going to have to invest a lot in water infrastructure and also in preserving land, because when you preserve clean land, the water rains on it, filters it out, makes for a cleaner river, better for us to drink. So funding for those things are sort of the biggest factors that are determining this election. I think the local issues are what are sort of driving people to vote on the environment, those and global warming.
Can I jump in?
Please.
I was going to say, Julia, it's a good segue for you, I'm sure, for the water issues.
So I think one of the, this is a fun panel. Is this a fun panel? I think one of the issues that I was talking about, which is, you know, what's been done, all the progress that we've made environmentally, you know, we've seen getting chipped away because of you know, not supporting adequate regulatory agencies and not supporting funding. And we are really fortunate to live in Philadelphia because we have a lot of private investment, foundation investment in water. you know, we have a Philadelphia Water Department that's a utility that has really invested in green stormwater infrastructure, and we're working to make sure they continue to do that, have that commitment. And we have the William Penn Foundation, which has really invested in our circuit trails to get people next to water, and the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. But you know, the reality is that the federal government is really big and has the resources to match these kind of things. And many of us growing up saw the federal government. I mean, I think this has really changed over our lifetime. You know, for those of us who grew up with the space race and thought, wow, smart people work for the federal government and we can do amazing things, that seems so far away from now. Because we're sort of just running in place to keep up. But I think it's really important to keep that commitment and that pledge that we understand that regulation needs to continue to be funded, to be supported, and that the funding for really solving a lot of our problems is not, you know, the private sector doesn't have those kind of resources, and we need to say we're taxpayers and this is, we want to invest in our infrastructure and our country and the health of our citizens, and all of that. One of the other things I was going to say about, I mean, it's really, we're a very on-the-ground organization, in the streets, on-the-ground organization. We plant a lot of trees, and I think, and it makes us, it works. We know it works. We know we're improving water quality by planting trees along creeks. Scientists like Roland tell us that's what we should continue to do, and you know, it's you know, it's really, it can be sort of you know, sort of the kind of thing, people are tree huggers, and we feel like we don't want people to think of us as necessarily as tree huggers, because we know this is what works. This is what works, and it's based in science. But on days when it's really frustrating at what's happening at the state and the federal level, I would encourage you, in addition to supporting conservation voters and other environmental organizations, if you don't do on-the-ground stuff, and you don't support your local environmental advisory council or your local watershed organization, all those organizations, and one of the challenges is there's a lot of them. One of the positive things is that there are a lot of them. So wherever you live, you're in a watershed, you most likely have a watershed organization, and they would love to have you come to a tree planting and make a donation so that they can buy more trees. And the other thing that they would really like, and this is to sort of bring it back to the local level, is they would like you to get involved locally. So, you know, there's a lot of different levels of government, and local government, you know, Tip O'Neill said everything is local, and he's from Boston, so he knows. And, you know, if you think about, make sure that your local, you know, I'm always surprised, people get really frustrated with their local commissioners and what's happening at the local level. With, you know, decisions that commissioners make about development and decisions that are made about traffic lights and all those decisions, you know, those are the ones that really drive you crazy, right? And so, you know, we need to follow the models of all the people that are running for state and federal offices and run for local offices. Volunteer on the planning board and the zoning board and the environmental advisory council. They have a lot of power at the local level. And if you have a commissioner that doesn't, you know, doesn't vote the way that you want them to do, they make you a commitment, you know, we support trails, we support the environment. You know, you need to say to them, hey, wait a minute, you know, you voted on that resolution about trails and clean water and stormwater management. So, you know, now put your money where your mouth is, and we're going to watch how you vote at the local level. We're going to come to public affairs meetings and public works meetings. And there are organizations out there that can help you keep track of those kind of local issues. I know Penn Future has resources to do that. So I would encourage you, when you get frustrated and there's a commissioner that's just not doing what you want him to do, tell him you're thinking about running against him. You know, that'll get him moving a little bit.
So one of the things we do at Conservation Voters, we put a scorecard that tracks how the state legislators vote on environmental issues. Comes out every 2 years. New one just came out. And you can actually watch as it gets closer and closer to election day, more and more people start voting for the environment. You can actually just kind of track it. They really start paying attention around election day. So what she's saying is right. You threaten to run against somebody on an environmental platform, that person will be the best environmentalist you ever saw the next week. You don't even have to run.
Anna, you have some other thoughts as far as what the big topics are?
I think I'm just going to echo Josh. I think that, again, it's like water, air, energy, and how do those critical issues affect you in your community, and so kind of making it relevant to where you are. The funding part, it like blows my mind, and the contributions blows my mind. So I think that's another huge one. And we see that in Philadelphia too. We see that in the region, right, where we're seeing a lot of statements of support, but we're not necessarily seeing as much of the follow through as we would like financially. And so asking the decision makers to follow through with their stated commitments, with backing it up with budget line items and making sure those budget line items are actually sufficient to do the work, I think is definitely important.
Great. So that gives us a little bit of a flavor of where your electoral thinking can take you as you're looking at different issues. Let me ask something real specific here. We've talked about changes in both the federal and state government in terms of the regulatory environment, the regulatory environment of the environment, and the rolling back of regulations that's trying to happen now at the federal level. If there were one or two regulations, either state or federal, that you would say, absolutely, we cannot let that one go. It plays such a crucial role. What would those be? And I think the flip side of that is, and I'm going to ask us to change our perspective a little bit. Are there currently regulations that you think are around the environment that just really aren't working, and things that maybe either need to be changed or put aside? And I'm thinking particularly on it from a business perspective. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but just in general, what's sort of the key things that we definitely don't want to see go away, and what are the ones that are maybe things we should think about doing something about?
Okay.
And please don't.
I am very much not in the business of deregulating things, so I don't have a great answer to the second part of the question. Three things come immediately to mind. Here's my favorite. 2 months ago, they legalized asbestos. Not kidding. Trump administration has come up with a new use case statement for asbestos, and between July and August of this year, asbestos imports to the United States rose 2,000%. You're welcome. I say that merely because it has great shock value and you should take it and use it at cocktail parties. The two biggest ones that really matter, the Land and Water Conservation Fund expired on September 30th. Yep. Land and Water Conservation Fund, genius program, been around for decades, takes royalties from offshore oil drilling. Whether or not you think we should be doing that, we should certainly be using the money for good things. We can all agree on that. And it puts it into parks, forests, recreation. It helps fund things like Independence Hall, helps build the Flight 93 Memorial in Western Pennsylvania, and dozens of state and local parks in between. And it just died basically because Congress couldn't get its act together. So it expired September 30th. There's a huge campaign being run all over the state right now to try and put pressure on our members of Congress. There's some potential they'll bring it back in a lame duck session after the election, because it is pretty popular all over. The western states especially really care about it, but folks like Pat Toomey really need to hear from us, so I'd encourage you all to think about that one. And then the Clean Power Plan. The Clean Power Plan was President Obama's plan to deal with carbon pollution in this country. It was the first real limits on carbon from power plants. We absolutely needed to implement that. The Trump administration is attempting to get rid of the Clean Power Plan. Now, the Clean Power Plan is not perfect. It did not go nearly far enough, and it really never got implemented because various court cases blocked it. But it is the only plan we have to really significantly reduce carbon in this country. And we just learned we don't have enough time to make a new plan. We need to start implementing that one before we can implement another one. There is a comment period for that that's going on. So I'd encourage all of you to reach out on that Clean Power Plan, comment period, go leave a comment, say that you don't want the world to end.
So, Josh, I'll give you a few minutes to think about deregulation, and maybe we can hear from,
I'll work on it.
from Anna and Julie as far as what your thoughts are on it.
I mean, you know, I think we're a regional organization, and so a lot of our work focuses on, you know, what's happening at the local and state levels. And I think again, what we're seeing, and kind of this points back to the other answer to the previous question, but, you know, what we're seeing is that there is significant economic growth as a result of regulations for stormwater, for energy. You know, we're seeing that in California. We're seeing countries and states where strict regulations are being applied and enforced, and we're seeing economic growth as a result. It's in strong correlations. You can say causation. I say causation. You know, we're growing the kinds of businesses that are going to be able to respond to those needs. And so, you know, we're still talking about the same policies that, you know, we're talking about on the prior answer, and we need to protect those, and we need to make the case that, you know, it's to grow the kinds of businesses that will be able to innovate and provide the solutions to those pressing problems. Is that if we don't invest in that regulation, we're not going to see the innovation happen nearly as quickly as it needs to get us to a better place. So,
I think this is it's hard for this panel to be not pro-environmental or health and safety regulation. You know, and we look at other countries and California and other states where there's been regulation to help deal with climate change, and it's fostered an economy that's pretty healthy. It's interesting. I was in Canada for vacation. I was on the Gaspé Peninsula in a place called Pierce, and it was a community that it's a fishing community and a very beautiful, you know, people. There were no Americans. It was pretty fabulous. There were a lot of Canadian tourists. And it's a community that was really hit by a series of hurricanes. And they have a beautiful walkway and a beautiful beach that really got destroyed during a storm. And it was being rebuilt, and there were signs in French everywhere that talked about resiliency and climate change, and how this community was dealing with it, and the funding that was coming from the government of Quebec and the government of Canada to really deal with the resiliency of this community. It was pretty, and it's not that we're not doing those things, but this, you know, seeing that is really sort of astounding, I think, in a lot of ways. In terms of regulation, I just wanted to say something about the Clean Water Rule, which I think is an example of maybe how we spend a lot of time looking at these regulations, and they have, you know, because of our system, things get stopped, and then somebody sues, and there's public comment, and it's a pretty robust process, I think. And for a number of years, you know, there were attempts to really get rid of the Clean Water Rule that the Obama administration, tell me if I say anything that's incorrect, but, you know, that the Obama administration had worked really hard to define after some really confusing Supreme Court decisions. And, you know, the idea was, I think the worst thing about any regulations is that they're not clear. So there was an attempt to really clarify what the Clean Water Rule meant. And there was an incredible public comment period, and, you know, it went through this whole process, and then the new administration came in and went through the same process again to try to kill the Clean Water Rule. And because of organizations suing, you know, we still have that Clean Water Rule. But that's one example of a really important water regulation that defines what can be protected. And the kind of work that we do focuses on headwater tributaries, really small creeks that go into bigger creeks, that go into rivers. And they have, they have a really important function. And this is a rule that protects those small tributaries. And I know that the folks here at the Academy can talk about how important those headwater tributaries are in terms of the health of, the health of the creek and then the health of a river. So that's the kind of regulation that's really important, and that's, sort of one little victory that I think we need to sort of appreciate.
And thank you, Julie, for explaining the importance of headwater conservation, because in language that was clear, because probably from our science side we would have said things like riparian buffering of nutrient loadings, which maybe wouldn't have gotten quite the same message across. So we all have to work together on these things.
I came up with an answer.
Deregulation?
Yeah, I actually came up with something. One of the reasons that the business community has put so much money into tearing down the EPA and the state DEP is that they feel like these regulations are burdensome and hard to follow. I spent 6 hours today fighting a one-page campaign finance report. Sometimes bureaucracy can be really difficult to deal with. So while there's not a specific regulation that I'd argue with, I do think the business community has a point in that our regulatory infrastructure could be put together in a way that was much simpler to use, required significantly less use of lawyers, and sort of made it just easier for people to follow the law. And that's something that I do think, as we're rebuilding both of these agencies and the regulatory structures around them, that's something we should try to keep in mind. We should bring business in early and try to make sure that while we're keeping things clean, we're also making it sort of easy. I mean, we're all dreading April, right? The tax forms are just brutal, and the regulatory forms aren't a whole lot better.
Okay, that's a good point. I think we've been talking about what you can do and the kind of steps you can take. I want to think a little bit about messaging and communication on some of these things, because we've heard some stuff tonight that's fairly straightforward. I mean, the damage of climate change is pretty well understood, and economically we understand that. The ability of regulations to actually advance business and economic growth, as opposed to constantly being a problem, is easier to can be demonstrated. But we seem to be unable to talk to each other on a lot of these things, and I think it's no news to say that the nation's gotten fairly polarized on some issues, and obviously if we're going to be thinking about the environment as we go forward, it's everybody's environment. We all have to live in it and come across to it. Given the current political setting and some of the issues and the ways things are being communicated, is there something that from the environmental standpoint the messaging should be changed, or the messaging should be managed differently, or are there lessons that could be learned from other things in terms of how to find common ground on some of these issues? I realize that's a pretty general question, but I think you guys know what I mean. It's what's the steps to bring folks who maybe have been resistant to environmental protection more into this space?
I mean, you Josh, probably have a better sense of this than I do, but
I wish.
I think something that so SBN is part of the Clean Power PA Coalition, among other kind of efforts that we're part of, and it's a group of predominantly environmental groups, sort of national with state presence. Some are state focused and some are regional like us. But we are only one of two organizations part of that 20 plus organization coalition that's coming with the business voice. And we're part of that circle because the business voice matters. And what we've heard over and over and over again from those groups is that they really, really value the voice of the business community. And obviously, there are differing perspectives within the business community, obviously. But, the voice that SBN's members bring, and this is something else that's really important to kind of remember, is that the local independent business community, they create 6 out of every 10 jobs and have historically done so, through recessions. They are the backbone of a vibrant and resilient economy. No legislator that I've ever met has said, I don't support small business. And so when we bring the voice of that business community to the table, and that business community says, we care about this, when that business community cares about it because it's their product or service portfolio, or if it's not, that matters. And so that's what we've learned with the Sustainable Business Network is really, really helpful. And to something that you shared earlier, it's to bring in that business voice as early as possible too. I mean, a lot of the work that we do is collaborative and cooperative, and so we're trying to inform the direction of these things with the business voice as part of that, versus being reactionary or responsive, because that's kind of a comment period is not necessarily as helpful as crafting the thing together, kind of co-developing it in the first place in a meaningful way. Backtracking is takes effort and takes time, and there's resistance to doing that. And so if we can be part of that process in the the business community can be part of that process in the beginning, and the thoughtful, forward-thinking, values-based business community can be part of that process, then that's really, really powerful. So that to me is what I think we've learned as the message is the business voice.
Actually, the answer to the question is what these two environmental leaders do. Anna just sort of explained the business case, which is always the problem, right? It's whenever you're fighting for an environmental regulation, someone's going to tell you it's bad for business. Anna's the one who can tell them that they're wrong, and we really need that, and to show them how we can work together. The other thing that we really need to focus on is talking to different audiences. This is a pretty white room. Most of the rooms that I speak to are, and we've got to figure that out. Julie actually runs, I think, one of the most sort of diverse environmental organizations I've had the pleasure to see in action. And what they're doing is they're bringing folks who aren't us to the table. And that's what we've got to do. We're not going to get libertarians who believe that government is the villain in every situation. We're not going to get those people. We're never going to convince them. But what we do need to do are find the people who are directly impacted by things and get them to sort of start seeing the bigger picture. What we're trying to do right now, environmental organizations in this state have put together the largest ever, this is on the election side, again, I'm not going to name names, we put together the largest ever environmental effort for elections. It's going on right now. And we're knocking tens of thousands of doors, primarily in Chester County. And we're doing that because Chester County, for the first time, has been voting Republican since the Civil War. And it voted for President Clinton, or Secretary Clinton. Man, that hurt. It was the first time since the Civil War that they'd voted for a Democrat for president. It's also a place that's got a pipeline moving through it and a whole lot of open space issues. So environmental issues are playing a really heavy role there. So we've tried to build a permanent infrastructure to find those people who may just right now care about a pipeline, but who we can then show them, hey, you see how this pipeline is affecting you? Well, the reservoir below the pipeline is also going to affect you. And the broader water quality of the Delaware is going to affect you, and sort of move them up so they become people who are coming to forums like this. Because right now they're not. Right now they're raising their kids, and they got better things to do than think about politics or think about the environment. But if you can find that local issue, and this is what Julie does so well, and sort of train leaders out of it, I think that's how we build the base more. Because the hardcore libertarian, if you truly believe government's the enemy, you're never going to believe that environmental regulation's an answer to anything.
Right. Wow. Thank you for those kind words. I was just going to say, I think what we try to do is find. We try not to say environment very much, other than riparian. I mean, we never say riparian. But we try to. We try to talk about nature, and what we try to do is connect people to things that they really care about. So there's the part of what we do is get people engaged and to programs in Tacony Creek Park, which is one of the city's watershed parks. It's pretty neglected. It has a lot of challenges. It has a beautiful circuit trail through it, and it can be really quiet on a pretty crazy day in Philadelphia. So we get people to come on walks with us for health reasons, for fitness reasons. We all need to do that. We do a lot of nature and bird walks. There's a lot, the bird people are pretty crazy, so they'll go anywhere. We do a lot of history walks because this is Philadelphia. People really want to know like what's under the creek and what was the mill that was there. So it's sort of figuring out what people like, and I think in terms of environmental things, looking at the recreational users. I mean, we have a creek that we can't really put a kayak into, but if you want to connect people to the Delaware River, there's fishing, there's kayaking, there's a lot of things that people do where it's an opportunity to then talk to them about clean water. They all see litter as they're fishing. So, there's something to talk about. So I think it's sort of those, I don't know what the word, the nexuses or the connections there where somebody connects to a river or they connect to a creek and they get to appreciate it. That's why we know. I was at a press conference today over at Lardner's Point Park, which is along the Delaware, to talk about increased funding for the Delaware River Basin Restoration Program. And Lardner's Point Park is on the East Coast Greenway and the Delaware River North Trail. It's right below the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge. It's very beautiful. If you've never been there, you should go. And it's the kind of place where you're there and you can't not think about how important the Delaware River is to Philadelphia and to our water supply and to our history. So it's doing those kind of connections is, I think, what makes, what really sort of connects people.
Yeah. And can I add to that real quick? Just to add to that real quick, I think there's actually really interesting history that you spoke to. If you think about a lot of the, kind of the Clean Water Act in particular, I think Clean Air Act to some degree too, but it was the hunting and fishing groups, it was the sports folks that actually helped to get those environmental protections enacted in the first place. It was, like Teddy Roosevelt, right? So, so it's really interesting history where we had, kind of the groups now that are not necessarily known currently for their environmental protection advocacy efforts, historically actually supported those efforts to happen. So I think it's really speaking to kind of the interests and the needs of, where people are. That's a good point.
I never thought that I would be, I have a colleague who was an employee of Trout Unlimited. That really surprises me. So, these are people that are about fishing for trout and they really appreciate clean streams. It's coming at from a different way. Can I add one thing about regulations? I mean, we work with a lot of municipalities and, municipalities are responsible, and I don't want to get into the whole acronym of all the acronyms with stormwater management, but municipalities are responsible for stormwater management systems, and for the pollutants, for dealing with the pollutants of runoff pollution and what comes off our roads and everything. We've dealt with industrial pollution, now we're dealing with runoff. It's a lot harder. It's really diffuse. And what we've done and what we want to do is have regulations that require municipalities to do that work and to figure out how they're going to make their creeks, bring their creeks back to health by managing stormwater in a better way, but we haven't provided the funding. It's really the stick and it's not much of a carrot yet. So, no wonder municipalities complain about it. It's a real challenge for them. So I was just thinking about that. It's hard to have regulations without incentives and funding as well.
Great. So we've got about a half hour left. I've got a couple more questions to ask if we need, but I want to give the audience and folks a chance to pose any thoughts or questions that they might want to say. We're not going to use mics tonight. It's a little cumbersome, so please just ask from your seat, and I'll call on whoever wants to speak, and we'll ask you to put it eventually in the form of a question so that we can move forward with it. And then if folks can't hear it, I'll be happy to repeat whatever folks want to say.
I had a question for the audience.
Okay, go ahead, Julie.
I just want to know by a show of hands, it's 2 weeks till the election, right? So how many folks are, I'm really going to put you on the spot, and between now and the election and the end of election day, how many people in this room are planning on working on canvassing, on working for a candidate, on making phone calls? Yeah,
All right.
two hands. All right, now I feel much better. You can. Cool.
That's
If
okay.
you're
That
not-
that was the little,
And if you would like to, come talk to Eva in the front row, who'd be happy to sign you up and tell you how you might help do that.
no, that was a little refreshment we
That
needed
was
there. That was
really
good.
good, yeah.
Very, very good idea. So anybody else? Anybody have thoughts or questions? Yeah.
I have a question around the regulation. I'm wondering instead of deregulation, is there any policy or legal policy you think might be able to come together to make one policy instead of having multiple regulations around one issue?
So the question is there, let me make sure I'm saying this right, is there a way of consolidating some of these policies and regulations so that they aren't so spread out, or ways to make them more effective or efficient? I think that might have been what Josh was referring to partly, but any thoughts?
They're so complicated. Each one is so complicated. I do this for a living, and I don't understand half the words in many of the regulations that we talk about. The acronyms alone are brutal. The closest thing I think we have, in this state, we actually have a constitutional amendment that protects our environmental rights. We're one of the very few states that has that. It's a pretty amazing thing, actually. Julie talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. About 30 years ago, a number of environmental folks got this put into our state constitution through an amendment process. No one's really taken it out for a spin yet, but what it says is that the people's right to clean air, clean water, and public lands shall not be infringed, and that the state, as the steward of those lands, basically owes us clean air and clean water. And I should know all those words by heart, and I do not, and that was embarrassing. But that's as close to kind of a grand unified theory of environmental regulation as you can get. And I think one of the things that happened a couple years ago, a case passed through the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that for the first time said that that right is just as powerful as our right to free speech, as the other sort of constitutional rights that are listed in our state constitution. We haven't yet seen the fallout from that, but what it means is that anytime the state makes a decision that allows our constitutional right to clean air, clean water, or public lands to be infringed, we now have the recourse to sue. And so it's actually a really kind of exciting time here in Pennsylvania for that reason. It was a huge win, so it came through the courts, and as things that go through the courts often do, it's going to take years to kind of see how it works. But something like that's probably as close as I can think of.
Any other thoughts on that question? Or?
I think the world is a really complicated place. And I know that water legislation and regulations are really complicated because they were written at different times for different purposes, and they look at water in different, surface water and groundwater and all that in different ways. So I think that would be difficult.
So one here, and then folks over here.
The first is full disclosure, I work with Josh. I think I have an answer to the question about regulations. It builds on the question you just asked. There are examples where some states set the bar even higher than the federal government. I'm thinking, for example, fuel efficiency standards in
California, yep.
In my mind, we should be able to set the bar higher, and industry can adapt to these things. They adapt to local tastes when they manufacture things, so this is just known. But is that, how do you all, so Josh, how do you feel about the fact when the rules are different state by state? And should that encourage us to have more federal opposed to state?
Bill actually helped me prep for this event and then asked a question that he didn't prep me for. So it is a really good question. I actually think, the fact that California is ahead of the game on CAFE fuel standards, on on sort of solar energy, all of that stuff is great. There's such a huge market, they're able to force the rest of the state forward. Federalism is tricky, but I do think it's, right now, Governor Wolf is vetoing most of the bad anti-regulation bills that are coming out of the state legislature. So even as federal regulations may diminish and federal standards may diminish, Pennsylvania is holding firm. So there's a benefit to sort of having these two systems. It gets very complicated. Who's in charge of what? Who regulates what stream? There are decades-long court cases to decide that sort of thing. But it does provide an opportunity, and it means that the local work we do here matters a whole lot and could be sort of pace setting. You know, right now Pennsylvania is not, other states are not looking to us as a model of great environmental legislation, but that's a place we'd very much like to be in. I think it's a place we could get in the next decade.
Yeah, I was going to build on that too, because I think, you know, I think something that we've been observing kind of SBN is, you know, while we do have all of this deregulation at the federal level, it is driving local activism, and it is driving, you know, kind of cities and municipalities and, you know, states to a large degree to think about, you know, what they can do differently, and if it is stronger policy, then, you know, let's do that. And so I think that there can be, and there should be, more examples like California and the United States, you know, that are pointing to demonstrable, you know, proof that environmental regulations don't stall the economy, that they actually grow the economy, and the more and more examples of that we have, I think that, you know, we will see some change at the federal level, you know, based on, you know, who's in charge, but we will. And so I think that, you know, think globally, act locally, like what we see, you know, if we can sort of be the models and then you know, be the proof of concept. I mean, that takes also legislators that are willing to be a little bit you know, not so risk averse, but it's important. And so, yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. Thank you for asking that.
The states should be incubators for really good ideas, and I think that, you know, we think, you know, that I think we're very sort of tunnel vision, and we don't think that things can happen differently in different places, but, you know, there are states that do a better job with education and do a better job with environment and energy. I was appalled when I moved here and there was no bottle bill, because I'm from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has had a bottle bill for a very long time, and that's the kind of thing that you would never say in the Pennsylvania state legislature, because the bottling industry is so powerful. So,
Do we have a question over here, or let's go? Okay, here, please.
Is there a United Scientists of America group that could start raising their voices very loudly and teaching people that science is real and not fake? We need you desperately, desperately.
There's actually a lot of answers to that question. And I don't want to eat up all the time with it. But there are certainly scientists that are becoming more vocal and more active, particularly on issues like climate change. It's not really baked into the scientist culture to take stands on political issues. It's not. And it's something that we're grappling with a lot here at the Academy, because as I said, we did some position papers a couple of years ago, which was one of the first times we've stepped out on something like that. It was not, you know, we certainly weren't making radical positions. We said climate change is real and we should do something about it. But it was still a big step for us. I think there are certainly groups, you know, Union of Concerned Scientists and Physicians for Social Responsibility and other sorts of advocacy groups that enlist scientists in this kind of work. There are individual scientists, and there are, you know, growing statements and debates coming out within the scientific organizations. I think it's not going to happen all at once or a single voice, because no scientists ever speak with a single voice. If you can find any two that will agree long enough to conspire on something, I'd love to work with them. But they will. You know, there is a you know, I think a growing effort by scientists to understand a little broader about the implications of the work that we're doing. Yeah, we had one of you.
Well, another group of concerned scientists and engineers are the employees of the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm Sidney Ozer. I'm actually a shop steward for the American Federation of Government Employees local at the Environmental Protection Agency, Federal EPA, Region 3 Mid-Atlantic office here in Philadelphia, and we are concerned about our environment and how to care for it.
Give this man a round of applause.
Regarding regulations, EPA is set up so that 80% of what we do is performing QC on what industry is doing. It's an industry lead organization. We want our partners in industry and the states and the local counties to help us and clean clean up the environment. They're the ones that have their communities in mind, have the neighbors in mind. And so our agency's set up so that they are the leads on doing these things, and then we review what they're doing. And in response to that, you know, the agency was started, not a lot of people know this, but Richard Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency. And they are interested in business and neighborhood values and outdoor values. And that's how it got started. And what's also interesting is even though we're rigging staffing levels now, the agency budget proposed by the Republican Congress is essentially the same as it has been in the past year. So the people who are out there who have turf, who have people who are knocking on the doors, calling them, they understand that EPA is important. It's the current administration that's seeing that certain values and regulations need to be changed. And maybe Josh and other people can talk about a couple of things. Number one, the proposed realignment to take the scientific experts and put them under a cloud of the enforcement organization. Furthermore, to change the function of the agency so state liaisons would do this oversight or reporting of what's going on versus the EPA folks doing the oversight of our industry partners. And then furthermore, you might want to mention, or you could tell us about the proposed changes in methane reporting, which is very important here in Pennsylvania.
I don't really have anything to add. I think you said it, what needed to be said. The situation in DC is dire. And unless something sort of drastic happens on November 6th, it's going to keep being dire for 2 years. And, you know, if the Democrats were to take the House, there's a break suddenly, right? Suddenly you're too busy answering questions in a House Environment Committee hearing to finish your deregulation of X, Y, or Z.
But that's not a partisan endorsement.
It's not. If one wanted to see a break thrown, that would be a method you could do to throw a break.
Okay. Over here, next.
In the perfect world, the federal regulations should cover most things, but it's not perfect. For two reasons. One is there are a lot of site differences that need to have more protection on. But one thing that's happening now in DC with the people in EPA being forced to essentially gut their own regulations is that if states and large municipalities like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other ones continue to rely on federal regulations, and for the most part, our state relies on federal regulations, and they say, hey, we're going to permit anything to be built in this city as long as it complies with the regulations. If regulations continue to be gutted, then there's absolutely no hope, because major cities in our state will not do anything more than comply with the federal regulations. And we really do need, I want the environmental groups also to focus also on the major cities where there may be people who they think are, supportive of this, but who may not have strong environmental regulations and local regulations as backstop to what's going on in Washington.
Thank you.
How many people, Philadelphia residents? Not a lot of suburbanites tonight. Welcome, Philly. City council elections are in May.
Yep.
And I have not had a chance to plan for them, but I will in 2 weeks and 2 days after I've slept. So there's a real opportunity. There's a whole lot of people running for city council. There's going to be some real opportunities to try and increase the salience of environmental issues in this debate. That's something we're going to be working on. I'd encourage you. People are going to be, city council, there'll be house parties in your neighborhood. You got to go. And you got to go not just to the people you already know. You got to go to all of them. And you got to ask questions about what they're going to do for this. You're absolutely right. Local regulations are going to be huge. The city council has a tremendous power to do it. Mayor Kenny's tried some really interesting things. His Office of Sustainability is just very good, but the council has been slow to act on some of those things. And so getting some new councilmen, or even better, getting the new ones, the existing ones sort of jazzed up about environmental issues is going to be a big focus of what we're doing, and I hope you'll join us in it.
Right over here, I think.
As
the Pennsylvania, based on Pennsylvania Constitution. Right.
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know, you guys know where the
So it's a weird situation with the Attorney General's environmental protection arm, which was headed until recently by Steve Santorciero,
Right.
who's now running for a different office and therefore not running that anymore. They can't take a case unless the DEP refers it to them. And so there's a serious slowdown. I think Attorney General Shapiro campaigned on putting polluters in jail, which we were very excited about. He's had trouble doing that. I don't think it's a lack of will. I think it's just structurally been very tricky, and the DEP is not super excited to give him a lot of cases to prosecute. Not my area of expertise. I'm happy to look into it more, but we haven't seen as much as we'd hoped. That's why.
back there, yeah. Yeah. We are currently recording it, and I believe the plan is for it to go on our website tomorrow, actually.
Oh,
So
that's great.
at least that was what they told me earlier.
Wow.
One thing I'd say, I made a joke about email lists earlier, and Eva, who runs our email list, glared at me. We use ours, we have about 100,000 people on our list, and we use it to let them know when there's a bill moving through the legislature, and we'll ask you to call your representative. And I know you get a lot of email, everybody gets a lot of email. We try not to spam you, but we really do think that that's citizens calling their legislators is probably the single most effective way you can impact policy outside of voting and working in elections. So, and other groups do it too. A lot of groups do. One of the things we'll also do is put you in touch with other organizations that are doing good work. So I'd encourage you to sign up for those lists and actually read those emails. They really do help us, and they summarize quickly what's going on, so you'll have it in bite-sized chunks when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think we have time for one or two more questions. Right here.
Anna.
Yeah, a big part of what I talk about was sustainability. The corporations are doing, and the link between establishing renewable energy to replace fossil fuels entirely, giving them confidence that we show, yes, we can get something done. They have to be mobilized. They have to feel hope for the future. And I don't know why we can't do more mobilized in Philadelphia. Public forums, the focus is on solutions, not on all the problems, the wrong cases.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. So folks that didn't hear, it's sort of mentioning that it's really important to also focus on all the good things that are happening, all the solutions that are being contributed, to these pressing problems. From the Sustainable Business Network's perspective, I mean, we have a program called our Best Practice Forum, which is 6 times a year, which puts business owners, independent business owners on a panel, and they talk about what they are doing. They are the thought and practice leaders in this space, so they talk about what they're doing for their communities, they talk about their governing structures and how they're supporting their employees. They talk about what they're doing for the environment, and they share their learnings and best practices with other businesses that are trying to make those improvements. And so, you know, that's a really, really powerful program. So if you are interested in learning more about what at least our local regional business community is doing, the best practice forums are a really great place for that.
I know we have one more all the way in the back here. Yeah, please.
So, I've worked in heavy industry most of my life. Before RICRA was regulations, but it was the law. And frankly, and Steve and I were talking, as an internal environmental person, it's always helpful to have strong environmental regs. But also, I think there's an opportunity, and I keep seeing it, it's just what this gentleman just said. I've taught for, 2005, course of sustainability. It's really about critical thinking. Major industry, when the regulations came out, it was very complicated. And how do you comply? And basically, we found solutions not only that were compliant, but I think hundreds of thousands of dollars off the bottom line every single year because of the clarification that the regulation did around hazard and risk. Some of it, yes, maybe is externalities, you know, like odor, lighting, air pollution, or that kind of thing. But a lot of it was actually the bottom line of the way the company operated. And it would be great to tap into that. Anna, of course, as part of the SDND, you know, that's great, but also major corporations have paid over the decades hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had to do all, honestly, I was sick in the late 80s, early 90s when the industry was going to China and the things were syndicated because of environmental regulations. And now we know, you know, the pollution that was in Russia and China, you know, now they're told to try to regulate themselves because they realize that actually it's not economic to have all this stuff in everybody's sick. So I guess I'm sorry it's not exactly a question, but I think there's a challenge here is that when one of the local people who was in sustainability at one of the local universities who I know well came up to me at an SDN meeting and said, how am I going to convince the facility folks to buy into sustainability? And I said, I was having a conversation. I talked about the challenges in their budget and then get to understand underlying what the problems are and make sure they align with the solutions that are robust. And I think that's a lot of times, you know, rhetoric makes people turn off because they think it's their problem. You don't realize actually, you literally with water, with energy, with resources, with everything, hundreds of thousands of dollars off their operating budget. And I can't believe that there isn't a way to create a case out there for industry to be paying. But that's, you know, I'm wondering if you know, if you've had any experience trying to bring that.
And I think that's what we were hearing from
Yeah.
Anna earlier, that, you know, trying to, and Julie was saying as well, as to, in terms of the language. I know there's other questions. We are out of time. I do want to pose one more question to folks, and this, hopefully this won't be too hard to come up with. If you had, and I think folks may be around a little while afterwards if folks want to try to get into conversations. If you had one question or one thing you were going to say to a candidate, if you were a voter, and you wanted to speak to one of your candidates for office or speak to the two of them and get a sense of what would be kind of the most important thing you think a voter could ask or say to them? And I actually gave you this question beforehand, so I hope
You
everybody
did.
practiced it. So.
Well, I mean, I've thought about it, and I haven't quite thought about the perfect way to phrase it, but a question that really, again, from our perspective, a question that really asks, you know, decision makers to try to articulate how they see the economy directly connected to the environment and climate. And if they can't articulate that connection, then we have work to do.
All right. I came up with an answer, but it was really long, so I'm going to come up with a new one quickly. You were saying that no politician has ever said, I'm opposed to small business. There are a few politicians who will say they're opposed to the environment, but very few. Most of them are you for clean water? Well, yes, I am. They like to tell you what you want to hear. That's one reason we produce a scorecard that actually tracks how legislators vote on these issues. There's a candidate right now in one of the suburbs who is running on an environmental platform. He is telling everybody he is pro-environment. He has voted against the environment 73% of the time he's been in office. Everyone talks a good game. You need to look at what they've actually done. If it's an incumbent, you can look at our scorecard. If it's a challenger, go look at what they've accomplished in their life. See if there's any proof of the fact that they care about their community. It doesn't have to be about the environment. I'm looking for someone who's invested in their community and spent time to make the lives of the people around them better. And that may be someone who's been doing that through education, or it may be someone who's been doing it through healthcare. But those are the people who are going to take good care of the environment. So look for that. Don't trust an answer. The answer is easy to give.
Is that a yes or no? Like, is that a distinction? No, I mean, seriously, is that a distinction between a yes or no question versus an open-ended tell me how connection?
No, if someone can give you if someone can answer the question as Anna would answer the question, that's probably someone you could trust. But, yes or no questions often tend to go pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And in a situation where you're interacting with a candidate, you're often not going to have time to ask really in-depth questions. We do a questionnaire. We ask every candidate in the state to fill out a 20-odd question questionnaire, and they lie like crazy. If they governed as they answered those questions, we'd be living in California.
Thank you. And Julie, do you want to have the last word on this?
Oh, my goodness. I was just going to say, I think that you have to look at people's records. It doesn't really matter what they say, it matters how they vote. I think that's the most important, that's really the most important thing, is if they put their money where their mouth is. And if they haven't voted yet, you bring in a list of what's important to you, and try to get them to explain, if they know where their drinking water comes from in a community, some really basic questions to ask them about, and to ask them what kind of environmental issues they may be concerned about if they have children.
Great. Well, once again, I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. Thank our speakers for being here. The next town square, I'm not sure the date. It's in November, and it's going to be a somewhat switch to President's Hair. So please check our website and learn a little bit about an odd piece of history.
Really weird. President's hair.
You got it. You have to come and hear about it. Thank you all again.